I noticed that when I said everybody could take a seat, Elizabeth immediately stood up, just to prove that I work for her. My name is Tim Hodson. I'm moderating this panel because it was my idea, and sometimes being the director of the Center for California Studies means I get to call the shots. Once in a while when the staff isn't in the room, but not often. And so what I like to do to continue the tradition of an imperial directorship is I will talk a little bit more than I would normally do as a moderator to set the context and then introduce the panelists. The reason why we wanted to do this panel is the emergence of nonprofits and foundations in the public policy world. In the last 20 years, obviously both in California and nationally, public policy arena was buffeted by serious long-term fiscal problems and the predominance of a political philosophy that, with some exceptions, embraced the notion of the government that governs least governs best, with an enthusiasm that hasn't been seen since Cal Coolidge. At the same time, economic and social forces produced a new generation of nonprofits and foundations. Many times these new foundations and nonprofits were viewed as a reason why, reason why government could be limited. After all, government didn't have to do this because the private sector, nonprofit sector could. Also, simultaneously, as the only as the only hope when government programs were constricted and curtailed. Now, there are observers who will argue that the incredible personal wealth generated in Silicon Valley and in the entertainment industries will soon produce a new generation of Andrew Carnegies, Solomon Guggenheims, Rockefellers. This is probably true. And it will mean, especially in California, that the public role of nonprofits will become even more important than it is today. Now, I was educated as a political scientist and later educated as a legislative hack. In both roles, I was taught to identify, to analyze, to try to understand, and to question new sources of power in government and public policy. What are the implications of the rise of the initiative process since 1974? What is the nature of the biotech industry, and should it be subject to greater government regulation? What are the consequences of the new breed of joint power agreements among local governments? Yet, there has been comparatively little public discourse on the appropriate role of nonprofits in governance and public policy issues. And very often, the discourse that has taken place is more motivated by ideology. If I don't like the ideology of a foundation, I will criticize it, but I won't ever question foundations that I agree with. And I think this is a little unfortunate because, as with anything else, whether it's the Joint Powers Agreement or the Rising Initiatives, we need to take a look at all new actors. For example, I think some of the most interesting work going on in California today is in the local government area, and it's being done by groups like the LA Metro Forum and the Great Valley Center, and the group in San Jose, which I can never remember the name of.
Joint Venture Silicon Valley.
Joint Venture Silicon Valley. These are really interesting, innovative, exciting groups that are bringing together all sorts of stakeholders: labor, homeowners, government officials, educators, community activists, to try to solve problems facing the community. These groups have a potential of having arguably one of the most important impacts on local government in California since the progressives. Now, where did these groups come from? Where were they funded? LA Metro Forum and the Great Valley Center would not exist if it wasn't for generous funding by nonprofits and foundations. Now, let me give you a hypothetical. What would the news media say? What would elected officials do? What would academics conclude if they learned that it was the Disney Corporation that funded the LA Metro Forum, or Apple Computer funded Silicon Valley? I still messed it up. Questions would be raised that haven't been raised in the past. Last spring, a relative of mine, a relative of a good friend of mine, recently moved to Indianapolis. He was a civic activist who went to a meeting conducted by the Lilly Foundation about a new public policy project that was going to happen. My friend thought, my friend's relative thought that the project was fine, wanted to get involved with it, and at a public meeting raised a couple of questions about, well, why was the Lilly Foundation going to fund this? What were they going to get out of it? Well, he learned that in Indianapolis you do not question the Lilly Foundation. The Lilly Foundation representatives asked for the person to be removed because they were insulted at the imputations, that what they considered were the insinuations that they were somehow not acting in an appropriate fashion. And my friend's relative, who happens to be a Lutheran minister, got up and left. 2 years ago, Governing Magazine carried an article describing the not too pacific reaction of Republican legislators in Pennsylvania when they learned that the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation had offered to fund a series of mental health programs that the legislature was not in favor of. I mention these to illustrate some of the issues I hope we will discuss today. Why haven't nonprofits been subject to the same type of public scrutiny that others doing the same thing would be, and should they be? But far more importantly, what should be the proper role of nonprofits in making public policy? Given the fiscal and political restraints on state government and the money available to nonprofits, what are the obligations and what are the rights of nonprofits in 21st century California? Now, our panelists today, and I'll introduce them in the order that I would like them to make their introductory remarks. Nick Bowman from the Irvine Foundation. Nick is one of the better known program officers in the world of California nonprofits and works for one of the more innovative foundations active today. Jay Schrenier represents the Foundation Consortium, which I'm tempted to call a foundation for foundations. Jay is a policy analyst, having worked for the Senate Office of Research for many years, and a policy maker, being a member of the Sacramento School Board. Susan Rasky, on my right, is a frequent contributor to the California Journal and many other. He was one of the leading journalists in California, a faculty member at the Berkeley School of Journalism, and someone who's been very patient with me since I misspelled her name, which in turn meant the staff misspelled her name on the program and everything else. Elizabeth Kirsten is a director of the Senate Office of Research, is a user of research developed by nonprofits, one of the most trenchant political analysts in Sacramento, and as I pointed out last night, the second best boss I've ever had when I worked for the Senate Office of Research. So let's start with Nick, then move to Jay, then Susan, and finish up with Elizabeth. I've asked everybody to speak about 10 minutes. That would give us plenty of time for interaction with each other and with the audience. So, Nick.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And thank you very much for putting this issue and this subject on the agenda for this conference. This is a set of questions with which we at the Irvine Foundation grapple all of the time, and I'll explain to you a little bit about why we do that. For ourselves and for our grantees, the nonprofits that we support. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are, what kind of philanthropy we practice. One of the first lessons is that there are many, many styles of philanthropy, different kinds of philanthropic organizations, and I'll tell you a little bit about what kind we are. I'd like to describe a project that we have underway that is very much engaged in the civic and public policy arena as an example of the kinds of things that we do, just to stimulate the conversation, and then I'll offer a couple of lessons that we've learned in the process. Many of you may not know, the James Irvine Foundation is a statewide foundation. We were created 60 years ago out of the wealth of James Irvine, who came from a long line of merchants, farmers, and ultimately developers in Orange County. We have assets of about $1.2 billion. We make grants of about $50 million a year to a wide variety of organizations, about 250 to 300 organizations each year. in total, covering 8 different program categories that our board has selected to work in. Our mission statement says that our job is to serve the people of California. It's pretty broad, so the board has the opportunity to find those areas in which we have some comparative advantage, we have competence, there's a need in the community, there are competent and effective nonprofit grantee partners that we can work with, and there are strategies that legitimately and effectively we and they can pursue to achieve our common goals. So we are, in a sense, we're kind of a community foundation for the state. We have the flexibility to work where we will. And that is a great advantage to us, and it really informs our style of philanthropy. Though we have been around for a long time, we like to think that we are like some of the new philanthropists that are coming out of the entertainment industry and the Silicon Valley, and that is to say that we don't practice transactional philanthropy where we find a good project, throw the money over the transom and wish them well. Many foundations do that, and it's a perfectly good thing to do. We tend to be more like investors. We have explicit strategies at the foundation about how we can achieve certain ends that we and the fields in which we work are interested in achieving. And we hold ourselves accountable to following those strategies and being effective within them. That means that when we make a grant to an organization, we don't go away. We stay with them as a technical advisor, sometimes as a prod. We hope that we're always in a kind of a supportive role, enabling them to do what they want to do. We find that we have opportunities to link them to other funders, to other partners in the government sector, in business, and elsewhere. And we do a lot of convening. We have found that there aren't as many venues as we need to have in California where people who have common interests can come together and find themselves, find each other, and find new ways to extend and practice those common interests. So we think of ourselves as an investor kind of philanthropy, and we hold ourselves accountable just as private investors hold themselves and their companies accountable for outcomes and results. Tim mentioned the Metropolitan Forum Project in Los Angeles, joint venture Silicon Valley, the Great Valley Center. The Great Valley Center is probably a good example of how we practice. Together with the Hewlett and Packard Foundations, we created the Great Valley Center with leaders in the Central Valley. We each provided $1 million startup grant to that organization with an extraordinary president, Carol Whiteside. Many of you will know her from her years here, also a former mayor of Modesto, and she has put together an extraordinary staff. The 3 foundations sit on the board of the Great Valley Center because we have a very substantial investment and because we want to bring other tools and linkages to the work that she and her staff are carrying on. So that's probably the prime example, Tim, of this new kind of venture philanthropy. Let me talk a little bit, if I might, about a new project, and I've got a one-page description of this up here for those of you who might be interested in it. It's called the California 2000 Dialogue. About a year ago, together with the Hewlett Foundation, we convened about 20 nonprofit organizations and a few folks in the government to try to get a better fix on what kind of work was going on in governance reform, in fundamental governance reform, and how was it going forward? Where were the points of convergences? Where were the strategies for moving these ideas, whether they moved through the legislature or to the ballot? But that's far in advance. Just at that moment in time, essentially trying to get a picture of who was doing what. In the process, what we and they discovered together is that many of these good government organizations were operating in silos. They were operating in isolation from each other. Many of them located right here in Sacramento, down the street from each other, didn't know either the programs or the strategies of the others, and therefore either were likely to create some train wrecks down the road where they ran into conflict unnecessarily, or they were, more importantly, missing some important opportunities to work together where there was some convergence. And when I'm talking about these organizations, let me give you examples. League of Women Voters, of course, but also the California Business Roundtable. There are a wide variety of organizations from the nonprofit sector. They're all non-tax exempt institutions, but representing social and health service organizations, representing environmental organizations, but also representing business and labor interests that are working on these kinds of issues and might have some points of convergence but simply didn't know it. So we organized the California 2000 Dialogue, and its purpose is to engage these folks with each other, to bring our support to them through convening, through data analysis and other efforts, to ensure that to the extent possible they are maximizing their ability to work with each other in coordination and to get something done. We don't bring a policy agenda to that, as much as it might surprise you. We have values that inform our work, but we don't predict and we don't dictate outcome. That's for them to do, and for them to do with the people of California. One thing they have clearly had in common as well, in addition to not working with each other as effectively as they might, and that is that they haven't worked effectively with the people of California either. We conducted some opinion polls and focus groups and found what now is commonplace, but is discouraging and depressing every time you learn it anew, and that is that on the positive side, Californians are very interested in solving the problems of growth, of congestion, of improving schools, addressing crime and safety and security issues, of increasing open space and parks and recreation opportunities and better planning, a whole series of issues, and are at a lay level reasonably attentive but not well informed. Their interest and knowledge in what government might actually do to help solve those problems is at an all-time low. And their interest, frankly, in getting involved is at an all-time low. This is probably the first generation of Californians that have been well schooled in alienation from their government. It's not an ideology, it's now embedded in the culture of the people of this state. And that creates a challenge for anyone in government, as well as the rest of us who are interested in good public policy, because it's a prescription for volatility, for taking matters into your own hands, as in the initiative process, where essentially the people like to legislate because they don't trust that government can legislate on their behalf. So, faced with this situation, and knowing that there were going to be some major proposals for governance reform coming out of the work of these various public and nonprofit organizations over the next several years, in addition to this policy roundtable where they talk with each other, we've launched into a civic engagement campaign using the best strategies we know how or we can adapt from the commercial sector. We will engage, hopefully, the media effectively in understanding these issues and presenting the options to people and urging and stimulating them to get involved. Many of the nonprofit partners that do have the capability of creating events in towns and communities around the state, the League of Women Voters, for example, will indeed conduct those kinds of events. They're committed to doing 60 forums on tax policy, land use, and fiscal reform issues over the next year or so, and there are others who are doing the same. And we're entering the field of internet mobilization. We've taken a careful look at the candidates who've used the internet very successfully, Jesse Ventura being the most recent and probably prominent example of that, using websites and emails as a civic engagement tool in a much more effective way. I'm particularly interested in that operation because everything we know and we've found out from our polls and focus groups with young people tells us that that is the way to their hearts and minds. They are not going to come out to League of Women Voters events. They are not reading newspapers. 50% of them get their news off the internet as it is, and that will only go up, not down. So rather than wringing our hands and wishing it weren't so, we're going to where they are, and we're going to try to reach them through an interactive and mobilizing website and email campaign. Well, This effort, as I say, is funded by the Hewlett and Irvine Foundations. It is, with respect to outcomes, policy neutral, but not value neutral. It is focusing both on the insiders in Sacramento and the outsiders, the people, in communities across the state. And it is a long-term and determined effort to raise the level of civic engagement, and through that, the quality of governance in our state. What we have learned in the process, and I'll close with this, is that this field, for those who wish to enter it, is wide open. There are many good projects trying to engage folks in civic affairs in their communities. Very few of these projects add up to a statewide movement. I think everyone probably agrees with that. And because we are a statewide foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation as well, if we can help to knit this together into a coordinated and statewide effort in which people in Eureka and the North Coast understand that they do have some common concerns with people in San Diego and the South Coast, and they have concerns and interests and opportunities in common with people in the Central Valley, then in fact we can rebuild, if you will, a civic infrastructure that will lead to better policies and overall to better government. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to sit on the half dozen questions I have and go to Jay.
Thank you. Let me start out by saying we have no assets and we don't do granting, so Nick is the person to talk to after the session is over when you want money. We are a consortium of 16 different California foundations, and we came together about 8 years ago around Healthy Start. There was a partnership between the world of foundations, the governor at that time, and superintendent of schools, Honig. So we've been working within California, and kind of were created to sit across the table as a voice for foundations in this one area when there was someone to sit across the table from. And we've gone through a number of iterations over the years as the government has changed and now come back where we think we have someone to sit across the table from again. Let me just say also that as a program director for the consortium, I certainly don't speak for the 16 foundations that we work with. We have specific policy issues in our work plan that they do give me a right to speak for, but today I'm just here as a representative of the consortium. Foundations that we represent are very wide in their viewpoints. We represent some community foundations. We represent some family funds. We represent some conversion foundations, and that's kind of one of the first points I wanted to make here, is that when you talk about the world of nonprofits, there's no world of nonprofits. There are nonprofits who are community-based organizations, who are foundations, and their viewpoints are as wide as anything else. You can't lump them together and say nonprofits as a corporate citizen or as a citizen should do X, Y, or Z. It would be just as lumping any other group saying all local governments should do this, all school boards should have some same point of view, which obviously they don't. So when we look at this, we can look at generally what are some things that we can do, I think, as foundations, but not what should this world do. I think that there are a few roles, and I assumed that when I spoke after Nick, he would have said everything that I was going to say about that role. There are a few things that I can speak about, I think, a little bit more generally, and I think some things that the consortium has been able to do over the last couple of years. I've been there about a year, so I'm not fully indoctrinated into the world of foundations, but I'm getting there as quickly as I can. First of all, as far as accountability goes, I think for foundations individually and the consortium generally, our accountability is to be stewards of our funds and good stewards of those funds. And that's the role that we will play now and forever. We are accountable to, we as a consortium are accountable to our foundations. Our budget's about $1.5 to $1.8 million a year, so relatively small. But foundations generally just need to be good stewards. We have a few roles that we can play, I think, that are very important that government may or may not be able to play. I want to make the point very clearly that I don't think foundations can take the role of government or replace government in any form. The amount of money that foundations can put out is really minuscule when compared to the amounts of money that government spends on any specific program. So I think that at the margins we can certainly play a role. We can play a role as a catalyst. I think that there's a lot of things going on, for example, in Prop 10 and early childhood development, where foundations can take the role in funding specific types of research and looking at types of best practices. We don't, in government, I think, put enough money into research and development. We probably don't put enough money into training and technical assistance for new programs. So those are roles that foundations can play in the margin, but we certainly can't take the place, nor do I think we wish to take the place of government and the role that government should play. Nick mentioned this, and I think it's a very, very valuable role that we do play. We can be conveners, and we can be neutral conveners. We have the opportunity, I think, to bring people to the table to discuss questions that they may not otherwise discuss with one another. This is a time, I think, when government and others are starting to think about what combinations of individuals do you need to solve problems. We can't continue to look at solving problems in the silo approach. You know, we have a problem, we have a program. It hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked for whole families or whole communities. And I think that the role foundations are attempting to play is to bring different people from different levels of government, different jurisdictions, and people who work in community organizations outside of government together to look at how do we solve problems working together. I think that foundations can be advocates for public policy change. The consortium certainly has an agenda. We've labeled it the community approach, which is really, to me, looking at how do families work and how do communities work and how can government systems work with them. You know, I think someone met with Al Gore last year and gave him a book in San Diego. If you're a typical family who doesn't have a lot of money, here's the number of applications you need to fill out, and the book was about this thick. So it's about how do we look at families holistically and bring government services to them and have them work with it where it doesn't kill them to enroll in government services. It's about questions of access, things like that. That's our agenda, and I think certainly foundations can play an advocacy role. California Wellness Foundation is doing a lot with gun control and safety and violence issues. But again, I think you have to be very careful. There are a wide range of foundations. Their ideology has a wide range, and there's different beliefs, certainly within my own consortium as well, about how far you can go being an advocate for something. Certainly in the role of research and development, technical assistance and training, I don't think government does enough. We are entering a partnership with the California Department of Education, for example, to help to provide some systemic ways of thinking about technical assistance and training for after-school programs. The state of California just put 85 or 50 million plus 35 million into after-school programs, about 1% for training and technical assistance. In my mind, no business would operate that way if you want to create a new system of anything without training people how to do it. And so our great fear is that we'll have 600 new after-school programs, and as I look at these people in orientations that we helped put on, it was deer in the headlights for about 80% of them, that they've never run a program before. So I think that foundations and nonprofits can play a role kind of at the margins to help ensure that programs are successful. How can we do it? I don't think foundations can do it alone. I think that we are learning more and more about how to work with others. I don't think foundations are any different than any other groups. Foundations compete with one another in a lot of areas. They may not work together well in some areas, and in some areas they do. But I think we're working along that road as well as government on how do you work together. But I think that it's very important that foundations can be a partner in this. I don't think that they can be really looked at as a checkbook to fund certain things that government can't, but they need to have a voice when they come to sit at a table with government and with others. they can bring, certainly, we can leverage a lot that we have. We can leverage the resources that we have and the names that we have to bring others to the table. But we need to be good partners with government to do that. I think that there's a certain value added when you bring us to the table. Government has, many aspects of government certainly have parameters that they have to work within that makes it difficult for innovation in some ways. Depends certainly on your elected leaders and their vision and who implements their vision. But I think that foundations can lend a role towards moving us forward into the 21st century in looking at communities, looking at families, how we have to work together, and really where government can be effective.
Thank you, Jay. Susan?
When Tim asked me to be on this panel, I said, oh, this is the Bite the Hand That Feeds You panel. In the interests of full disclosure, let me start out by telling you what my relationship to Assorted Foundations is and what my university's relationship is. I'm an acting associate professor at the Graduate School of Journalism, right? So I teach journalism full-time and I do my own writing. Our program is a relatively small program as the professional schools at the university go, and the main funding that the university provides for our program, as for all the others on campus, is for faculty salaries. And the rest of what goes on in our program goes on largely due to various sorts of fundraising and wheedling and what have you. Now, you wouldn't think it necessarily expensive to teach young people how to be journalists, but obviously there are equipment costs, other kinds of costs. And I was shocked to learn not long ago that basically half of the $3 million we spend each year is raised privately and comes from foundations. When I started to look at what our curriculum was, it became immediately clear that some of the courses we were offering not necessarily because we thought they were good courses, but because they happened to have funding attached to them. What a surprise. This is not to suggest that the funders interfered, were pernicious, were in any way anything other than generous. The point is, a significant portion of our curriculum is decided by who we can get money from. And we're always interested in finding ways to get money from other people, but that's a fact. And worse yet, because of rules of the university and rules of the various funders who've been kind enough to give us money to do some of what we want to do, the funds are not interchangeable. You heard Jay say that foundations need to be good stewards of the money in their control. Well, part of being a good steward is making sure that it's spent as you design it to be spent, and that means I can't take money that's designed to go for foreign reporting to teach kids how to cover the Capitol, period. I mean, that's the way it's set up. Nor can I take that money to buy paper clips. And sometimes, as I'm sure you know in your organization, the need is for paper clips. The need is for the unsexy, day-to-day, grindy kind of stuff that no philanthropist wants to fund, who, after all, would fund the paperclip fund. So that's, I come from that, so that's my role as an educator. And I am in the process now of applying for a grant from PPIC so that my students can cover the election, so I'm part of this. My colleagues have various grants from various foundations to support research that they're interested in. So that's my role as an educator. My role as a journalist is that I am in need constantly of information. So I rely on places like the PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, funded by Hewlett Foundation, or is it funded separately from the actual foundation? I rely on a lot of the polling they do as one of the major projects they've funded. I rely on their stuff about budget. I rely greatly on a small group you may be familiar with here in California, the California Budget Project, Gene Ross's work, which is terrific stuff for journalists. I mean, some of the best available material. I know Jean has a point of view. I'm very clear on who her funders are and what, part of the spectrum they come from, and she certainly makes no bones about it, but I got to tell you, she's got the best data going. So I discount for her point of view when I use her in my article, but I also feel absolutely free to call her in the middle of the night when I'm on deadline and say, Jean, would you please explain this tax thing to me? So journalists use the fruits of foundations all the time. The part of this that gets the disturbing, and what I'll confine most of my remarks to, is how much this has slopped over into the newsroom, not using these foundation-funded projects as sources, but in fact being partners with some of these projects. The most overreaching in this regard has been the Pew Charitable Trust, which have a separate civic journalism component, and that component awards grants to various newspapers around the country, or more often teams of news organizations who are interested in engaging the community. Some of the things Nick Bauman talked about. This is a huge controversial subject within the world of journalism about whether journalists ought to be involved in this kind of activity at all. I mean, in some cases, this has meant a newspaper or a news organization convening a community forum and then covering that forum as though it were news in its own pages. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that makes people like me want to tear their hair out. Anyway, these things run the gamut. My concern is not really the overt one that Tim started out mentioning, that this is like saying this survey was brought to you by Ford Motor Company. This story on cars, this story on the auto industry was paid for by Ford Motor Company. I don't think the connections are that overt and that pernicious. Much more pernicious is the notion of agenda setting, and some of the places where you find I guess where you find it most overtly are in public radio and public television. I was shocked to learn that the Lehrer Report's health coverage is funded by the Kaiser Foundation, which means that the salary of that very good correspondent is paid for by the Kaiser Foundation. That makes me crazy. Do I believe that the Kaiser Foundation is telling Susan Dentzer what to report, how to report it? Probably not. What makes me crazy is that the Lehrer Report doesn't think health coverage is important enough to fund on its own. What bothers me is that there is a specific grant attached to a specific kind of coverage. And, we can perhaps talk later about whether news organizations have effective enough controls to make sure that there aren't real strings attached to the money. But it's not just the Lehrer Report. I think you would all agree with me, the Lehrer Report is one of the better examples of, decent news coverage. The Kaiser Foundation is very involved in this kind of work. This is a special supplement the Washington Post sent out last year. They did a major survey involving the Post, the Harvard, and the Kaiser Foundation, and they surveyed a moral decline in America, or some such thing. Worries about nations' morals test a reluctance to judge. And they did a series of 5 articles, which I won't bore you with all the details of. What I want to tell you about is the survey team. This is this is smaller than what a newspaper page would be, but just so you can see, it's very fancy graphics, very fancy, expensive graphics, and then a box about this size telling me who the survey team is. And it says, these surveys are the 5th in a series of projects that the Washington Post, the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation, and Harvard University are conducting on contemporary issues. Representatives of the 3 sponsors work closely to develop the survey questionnaire and analyze the results on which this series is based. The Post and the Kaiser Family Foundation with Harvard University are publishing independent summaries of the findings. Each organization bears the sole responsibility for the work that appears under its name. The Kaiser Family Foundation and the Post paid for the surveys and related expenses. On and on and on. That's one of the better disclosures I have seen, and one of the better attempts I have seen to separate how the survey is interpreted. The fact that the Post had to jump through that many hoops to explain it all to me tells me just how squishy the Post must have felt about doing this. NPR has no shame whatsoever. I mean, they just do it. So the first question I ask myself here is not really is the material tainted, but the overriding question, which is really the question I want to leave you with. Why does the Post need the Kaiser Foundation to do this? I can perhaps understand smaller papers that have difficulty in engaging in a broad kind of survey. Why does the Washington Post, which has, as we well know, because we see their political polls, enormous financial resources and professional know-how in conducting major nationwide surveys, why does the Post need the Kaiser Foundation to do a survey like this? If it thinks it's important to survey these attitudes in the American public, then why not just go do it? And what I would argue, if I had been sitting in the newsroom, is why do they need to survey it? Why not just hire a few more reporters around the country and get them to go talk to people and cover stuff? Why do you need a poll to figure out these things? So that's the big news organizations. Now we get to the smaller news organizations. I wanted to read you some of the grants that the Pew gave out. These are last year's. I couldn't find easily this year's, but this is the one that made me nuts.
While Susan's looking, the noise is outside. Sacramento wants to wake people up every Friday morning. So.
All right. Again, this is the Pew. And the Pew did this was a grant awarded for election in connection with the elections in 1998. This was awarded to the Orange County Register and the Riverside Press Enterprise, KCET-TV, which is the PBS affiliate down there, KCRW-FM in Santa Monica, a small public radio station, and KPCC-FM in Pasadena, an even smaller public radio station, and the Orange County News Channel. This broad media coalition is seeking to find what citizens know and don't know about 10 ballot issues to be voted on in the primary and general elections in 1998. They are also working to create issue-based coverage for the region. Now, I'm sorry. If the Orange County Register and the Riverside Press Enterprise cannot figure out on their own that it might be important to know what citizens think about 10 ballot measures, if that's not a part of standard, everyday political coverage, and you must go to a foundation to seek funding to cover what ought to be part of your coverage anyway, I think we're in trouble. Question is, do I blame the foundations who make the money available, or do I blame the news organizations? And that, I guess, brings me to the point I want to close on. We really need two discussions here. One is, what ought people in my situation be doing about assuring proper disclosure of who they're working with and proper controls on the money that's coming into the newsroom? And again, the very subtle effect. I don't believe this is, you know, somebody standing over there beating you on the head and saying you must cover it this way and here's our point of view. It's much more subtle, which makes it, in my mind, much more dangerous. So that's one issue. The broader issue is, why, in the first place, is it working this way? And I'd offer you a list of reasons that perhaps we can talk about later. One is that the foundations at the moment are filling a political vacuum in this state. This has always been a state with weak political institutions, and they're particularly weak at the moment. Another is a fractured media, also always true in this state. You have a state with many different news organizations, none of which bother to circulate or have a voice outside their own metropolitan areas. Only recently has the LA Times figured out how to circulate in Northern California, and even then in only a limited and unsatisfactory way. You have underfunded universities, so that some of the leadership, some of this convening function that we've heard about today would have, I believe, in a previous time been properly dealt with in a university setting. You have a transitory population, which has always been true in California, but in the current setting you have huge waves of immigration, and that's creating both political tension and simply people moving in different places, so that you don't have a center of gravity. You have term limits, which is part of the political vacuum, of the weakening of political institutions in this state. And you have an initiative process, which is, in my mind now, fully a parallel legislature, where it isn't even worth the time and trouble to have these issues debated. And I guess my question to the foundation people, even though I don't wish to argue your agendas, many of which I believe in, is, are you not substituting for the political process? And in the end, as a journalist and as a citizen, I actually think that's bad, however good your intentions are.
Thanks, Susan. Elizabeth?
Maybe I'm here to make the case for the political process. I work in government. I work as the director of the Senate Office of Research, and we certainly are the beneficiaries of much of the good that the foundation community does, and I want to compliment Nick Bowman and the Foundation Consortium for much that they do to contribute to the public policy process. But I think I'm here to try to provoke a little bit, and so let me play that role. I certainly want to, again, reemphasize the importance that the foundations play in all of these aspects that our previous speakers have touched on. Let me just summarize them very quickly. We've talked about the role of foundations in the policy process, and again, I'm only speaking about the philanthropic foundations. I'm not talking about the larger NGO world. The role that the foundations play in public education and civic dialogue, and we commend them for their work in trying to encourage more citizen participation in the Prop 10 process, their ads on gun control that have already been mentioned. The risk-taking that foundations can do, because they are looking at issues that perhaps are not in the political mainstream. When Robert Wood Johnson Foundation came into Sacramento to fund school-based health clinics, it was extremely controversial and too hot to touch in the political arena. But it did stimulate a lot of discussion, and I think that even though we didn't get the school-based health clinics here, it did lead to some prevention efforts and Healthy Start and other state initiatives. The power to convene has been discussed. I think the alliances and the coalitions that the foundations helped create years ago when they started the Water Consensus Project that was managed by the Water Education Foundation helped spawn Prop 204, which was the latest Water Bond Act that the voters approved, and helped form some of the relationships that I think brought us a water bond that got through the legislature this session. The Growth Management Consensus Project brought together developers and environmentalists. Even though it didn't result in legislation, it did spawn, I think, the California Futures Network and a growing coalition around smart growth. Another very important role that the foundations play is the capacity building. We've heard mention of the Public Policy Institute in San Francisco, the California Healthcare Foundation, and others are making very major investments in analytical research and data that will help government make better decisions. Advocacy. There's a delicate balance I think the foundations play. Nick talked a lot about policy neutral but value-based decision-making. I think there is a very important contribution that the foundations are playing in the world of developing citizen grassroots advocacy. I noticed, for example, that the Goldman Fund just recently gave money to bring together the families who are victims of gun violence, and they're going to try to create a coalition similar to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. 6, the long-term focus. A foundation has the opportunity to look at a public policy issue over many generations, whereas the elected officials are looking at it over a 2 or 4 year period, and at most over an 8-year period if you're a governor. And so I think the opportunity that they have to make a sustained, ongoing commitment, regardless of what the polls are showing, is a very unique function, and I hope that that will not be lost. And then finally, most importantly, is when they do see the opportunity to partner with the public sector. I think those successful models that we have seen have been when partnerships have been formed in very open and full disclosure in these partnerships, going back to Susan's point about there is sometimes a subtle concern if you have maybe one group trying to control another. But I think the partnerships that I've seen that have been very effective this week, the Citizens Commission for Higher Education, which was funded by the Foundation World and which was co-chaired by chair of the steering committee for the Center for California Studies, Dennis Mangers, held a joint hearing with our Senate and Assembly Joint Committee on the Master Plan for Education, looking at the future of higher education in California and how we deal with tidal wave 2. This is an example of a citizen commission funded by the foundations helping the legislature sort out these issues and shape the future educational policy for the state. We have some failures in this regard. When the Citizens Budget Commission did its work, I think it helped create an analytical framework that then got passed on to the Constitution Revision Commission, which of course did not also succeed in its effort, but I suspect that some of that work will eventually find its way into budget reform. But let me just talk a little bit about some of the more policy question marks as we think about the role of the philanthropic world in California's future. Money is power, and power unchecked is corrupting. I work in a Senate where we had corruption. We had members go to jail. We had staff go to jail. We had the intervention of the U.S. Attorney. So I come to you very humble. I don't work in a perfect institution. I live in a glass house. But I do see how power can be corrupting and how it is very important to put in place procedures and codes of conduct. First of all, the philanthropic world is, of course, subject to the IRS regulations and what they have to do to maintain their fiduciary responsibility and the necessary disbursement of funds to just maintain their tax-exempt status. So that's a given. But let's talk about what other obligations might be for the philanthropic world. One, of course, is the given to have a standard of ethics. When there is self-dealing, the foundations that I know of, quickly move to correct those problems and to dismiss those people. I'm sure most foundations are operating under a code of conduct. They recognize that they have to pay their own staff reasonable salaries so we don't have the scandals of United Way, and maintain competent professional staff, which I think all the foundations that I've dealt with here really do maintain. I think the obligation they have is to evaluate what they're doing. Nick talked a lot about maintaining their own commitment to assess their outcomes, and I think that's another area where they help the public sector, because by sharing their lessons learned, both their successes and their failures, we in the public sector can better learn what benefits from these various interventions are possible, what combination of interventions are perhaps best needed, and how can we use this data and this evaluation to shape public policy. Another obligation is to fulfill the expectations of their charter or their foundation founding members, clearly identify what their purpose is. Nick again mentioned that the Irvine Foundation has the opportunity to serve all of California. Some foundations have limited geographic boundaries that they have to restrain themselves to operate within. Some are limited to just a particular policy area like the health policy. And I feel that those foundations that are most responsible are those who seek then to build strategic alliances, either in other geographic areas or in other public policy areas. And again, I want to commend like the Sierra Health Foundation for being part of the foundation consortium, so then they're linking their expertise with other statewide foundations. The obligation of representation. The legislature, when I started working in the legislature, we had, I believe, one woman member of the assembly. I was the second woman staff person. So I'm very familiar with what it's like to be in the minority and to not have representation. I was the founder of the Women in Politics, the Sacramento Women's Campaign Fund, and I now work in a Senate where 25% of the elected members are women, and almost half of the chiefs of staff to the state senators are women. I'm very sensitive to representation. We have sponsored, through the Women's Caucus, legislation to encourage more diversity on the boards of directors of corporations. Senator Calais, when she was in the Senate, was able to get a bill through to push for more women on corporate boards and to ask the Secretary of State to maintain a data bank of competent women who'd be able to be appointed. So I just raised the larger issue of representation and diversity on boards of directors for the foundations as well as in their own staffing. And it needs to be not just ethnic or gender diversity or sexual preference, but it also needs to be socioeconomic diversity. How many people sit on corporate boards who earn less than $50,000 a year? The obligation of sunshine. We all work in a democracy, and we have the media that's always available to scrutinize what we do. The legislature works in an open marketplace of ideas. The old days when Randy Collier and Willie Brown would write the budget in a closed room ended in about 1971 or 72. We now have sunshine voting requirements. The ideas that get floated, good or bad, are usually subject to public scrutiny. We have the last-minute deals like the big box bill that the governor vetoed, but at least it did have to get voted on, and everyone was on record. We also have the initiative process, which is open, even though we may not like those sleazy slate mailers that we get in our mailbox the day before the election. So foundations, too, are operating in an environment where they're going to be subject to scrutiny, and I think those foundations that are very forthcoming with their policies, their criteria, their procedures are obviously, I think, more likely to be credible and respected in the public mind. We get the annual reports from many of the foundations on who they funded, but I think it would also be interesting to have a better sense of what their criteria were and also what their strategic vision is for their future. Finally, the issue of peer review. Again, I've been in the area of medical regulatory review. I worked at the Department of Consumer Affairs during the medical malpractice crisis. We realized that in order to improve health care, we had to strengthen the peer review process. The legislature certainly saw the need to strengthen the peer review process in the aftermath of our scandals, and we set up a Senate Ethics Committee. So I think it's always appropriate for any organization, whether it's in the public sector or in the nonprofit sector, to have an ongoing systematic procedure for self-assessment. Again, sometimes this can be done through an accreditation process or simply peer review committees. Because if you don't do this, you're going to find yourself perhaps subject to media scrutiny, public scrutiny, or worse, legal scrutiny. One might ask, is there any kind of objective ranking of the foundations? Which foundations in California are doing the best job to serve the public in California? I certainly am not the right person to decide what that should look like or who should do that kind of assessment. That might be something the foundations themselves do. We in government get ranked all the time. California is always ranked, where are we on spending for transportation or education or class size or teacher salaries, all kinds of various indices. We have community indicators right now where communities are being ranked. We get the heading of whether Sacramento is a good place to raise a child or a family. So I think there's a larger question of, is there any independent, credible organization that could assist the foundation community itself in assessing itself and doing these rankings. So I would just like to commend Tim for putting this panel together. I haven't talked at all about the role of foundations with the academic world. I certainly hope that we can continue to strengthen the partnerships between the foundations and the Center for California Studies and the CSU system in general. I'm very pleased personally as a parent and as a taxpayer to see that Bill Gates is putting $1 billion into scholarships, and I think if there was just one thing that all the foundations in California could agree on would be to fund scholarships for higher education. I think that would be a vision for the millennium. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, it's your turn. Do you have any questions for us or comments? Gordon?
I think we all understand the impact that foundations can have on curriculum and that sort of thing. Let's turn it around and say, for example, say you look around and say, what does it mean to be American anymore? What does it mean to be a Californian? How are you going to deal with the problems and prospects in Southern California with immigration, different religions, etc.? And so you put together a program with nonprofits. You're going to attract certain foundations who are going to be genuinely interested in that. So it seems to me if the foundations can keep with regard to the concept rather than the particulars, and the institutions have enough integrity and strength that they don't have to seek the dollar to fund their program, then you have the possibility of a genuine discussion. To give one example, is that the Haynes Foundation in Southern California has been interested in education for 50 years. That's a legitimate activity. They're also genuinely interested in improving the quality of life in Southern California and encouraging social scientists to focus on that. That seems to me a legitimate activity. My association with the Haynes Foundation, they're not interested in micromanaging what goes on in the classroom. What they're interested in is that you don't pick their pocket. And at the same time, the academics don't want them in the classroom. So I think there's a common ground for discussion As long as the institutions have enough integrity, and as long as the foundations don't think their pockets being filled. And that's how I really do commend Tim for putting this conference together. I really think this is the way in which the conversation needs to be headed over the next 10 years.
Any comments on the comment? I agree with what Gordon said in an ideal world, and I think most of the time, but then you also have, it's a chicken and egg thing, the academic who says, I'm interested in 3 different things here, A, B, and C. What can I get money to study? C, so I forget A and B. Sir? Oh, I'm sorry. Nick?
Just to respond to that comment with which I agree, and I can only speak for the Irvine Foundation and reiterate that foundations are very different from each other. For example, we would never ask anyone to leave the room. We want more people to come into the room, and if the Lilly Endowment did that, we'd disassociate ourselves from that. And a lot of us in the foundation field, Susan, have a lot of questions about the Pew Charitable Trust's approach to that business that they are in. So please understand, I'm not talking for all of philanthropy. We try to support organizations and leaders in doing what they do. We have a general sense of what they're interested in doing and what kind of outcomes they're trying to achieve, but we really don't micromanage how they get there. That's not our business. On the other hand, and we have to find a balance here, on the other hand, we are change agents. We are always at the margin. We hope we are, learning about how to do things better, learning from the people we're funding, and learning from this one and passing it on to that one. So though our support is support of leaders and institutions to do what they do best, we are also critics of those leaders and institutions at the same time, and hopefully we're bringing them information, ideas, techniques that can help them to improve their work. So I don't apologize for being critics. I think that's part of our role, or for conflict where there may be some difference of opinion. But by and large, our job is to support people to do what they know how to do best.
Tim, can I add?
Sure.
I think Susan brought up a really good point, and it's one of responsibility and accountability. If someone's taking a grant and doing something just to get the grant, is that the foundation's fault or is it the grantee's fault? And I think that there's a balance there, and I can't speak for private institutions like the Post. I can say that, for example, for my role in our school board, we've had some very good results. We probably could not have done it without the generosity of David Packard and the Humanities Institute, which is a foundation that he's put together. And it's opened us to charges, for example, of, he's running your school system, because he's given us some pretty significant dollars on this. I think there's a public responsibility also there. When public institutions are looking at grants or getting grants, of holding us accountable for what we do with those grants. The Post may be a little bit different.
Okay. Sure. Yes. You've been very patient.
Many of the social problems that we face, which foundations ostensibly attempt to address, are outcomes or outgrowths of business policies. The same businesses that fund the foundations. And so my question is, what is the obligation, the responsibility of these foundations in their change-oriented processes to try to advocate or promote or support or enable changes in policies that affect adversely the same businesses that fund them? For example, let's say the Silicon Valley Consortium that you talk about. Many problems that now obtain in Silicon Valley are outcomes of the high-tech industries there. What's the obligation of that consortium, funded by the foundations, to adversely affect the businesses that fund these big foundations such as yours?
Nick?
I think that was directed at me.
Whoever has the money on it.
Nick?
I think you pose an interesting question. I want to respond in a couple of ways. One, there are foundations that are directly funded by corporations in the moment, corporate foundations. AT&T has a foundation. They explicitly link their marketing interests to their charitable activities. They disclose that, and you kind of know what you're getting. That's what they do. That's what capitalism is about when it's mixed with charity. Our foundation is not funded by business. The money was made by James Irvine from his business. But the money was given to the foundation. We now control it. We have no relationship to the Irvine Company in the sense that you might have suggested. What's interesting, actually, is that the foundation finds itself exactly as you have suggested, working on all of those problems that were created, in some cases, by the very businesses that led to the creation of the foundation. So that in Orange County, we are funding the Nature Conservancy to negotiate with the Irvine Company for open space and land protection. We're funding the other side. But we're not funding it really as just as a matter of conflict, but we're actually interested in whether there's some consensus that can be reached between the community environmentalists and the company about what the appropriate land protection policies should be in Orange County. So for us, it's kind of an interesting way of coming home again. One other comment, and this goes to the joint venture Silicon Valley project. In the beginning, this was a project of high-tech leaders interested in what the next generation of economic success was going to be in the Silicon Valley. It was formed out of lots of conversations in the late 80s after the microchip business looked like it was going downhill, and what are we going to do next? That was the question for the economy. They pretty much settled that question, or it's settling itself. And there is no question, if you've seen Steve Levy's reports on the future of the economy in California, that it's going to be very hard in terms of industry competition for the Silicon Valley not to succeed in the global economy in its own terms, in terms of market share and making money. They're going to do that. They are not going to succeed unless that place solves its quality of life problems. And there is a report from Steve Levy that we funded called Land Use in the California Economy. A lot of the leaders in Silicon Valley and elsewhere around this state in the business community have come to understand that the future of their businesses, their employees, and their ability to make profits and pass them on to shareholders is dependent upon the quality of life in their communities. And when I say quality of life, I mean, of course, the environment, open space, some of the more conventional ideas, affordable housing, things that are more directly related to their current workforce. But they also know that the quality of their life, the quality of life in that community is dependent upon economic advancement by low-income and minority people in those communities. So the newest project of joint venture Silicon Valley is something called the Latino Advancement Project. They want to work with leaders in the East Side San Jose Latino community to figure out how they can be helpful with each other in bringing both workers, managers, and leaders into the high-tech industry in a joint enterprise. Now, that wasn't the first thing they did. The first thing they did was to try to figure out how the economy could be made to work. But it was among the things that they feel they're responsible to do, and we're helping to support that work. So in general, if you accept that capitalism is the way in which we run our economy, in a mixed capitalism form, we're not going to change that. Then you try to figure out how can we make that work to the best interests of the people of California, and that's our approach to the business community, to our philanthropy with those organizations.
Somebody over here, Carol.
I guess I had a United Way question as someone who's been director of a United Way agency and also active with the regional board in my area. United Way didn't come up except in Elizabeth's remarks, and that was in conjunction with the scandal at the national level. But my understanding of the way United Way functions in communities at the regional level is much what Jay described as the work of their consortium, convening people, providing technical assistance to agencies, community problem-solving activities. And I just wondered if anybody wanted to comment on the role of United Way in communities throughout California. Are they in competition with the foundations? Do they work together?
I think that's a J question.
I'm not sure there's a J answer on that. We work with United Way. I mean, United Way has a number of indicators projects, for example, all through the state, and we're trying to work with them on that. I don't really see it as any competition. We don't have a lot of interaction with them. I don't know if Irvine does at all, but from the people that I deal with, I certainly don't sense any competition. I think United Way is more community-based in a lot of ways. Peter?
I'm going to make a hard answer question. At a minimum, it's provocative. I hope it is not found abrasive or offensive. I'd like bringing to play a tradition of, or a theory of private foundation, philanthropic foundation that starts with perhaps C. Wright Mills, goes through William Domhoff, and political scientist at Florida State, whose name I forget, two prominent books, Who Runs America and Who Rules America, feature this. And that is that the foundations are essentially highly conservative organizations in a long-run sense, whose main thrust is to preserve an existing order that distributes wealth, power, and income. If that existing order, given developments in humankind, technology, population growth, does not serve well humankind, what do we make of foundations that try to preserve?
Susan, that's for you, I think.
It is. I might frame it a little differently, but what you're really getting to, or I hope you're getting to, is what ought to be the question every journalist has. If you were not the Irvine Foundation, but the Irvine Company, I, as a journalist, know exactly where to put you, how to deal with you, who you are, what interest you represent, and how to report on you in an intelligent way, right? Foundations, we have the idea that there is press oversight of foundations, I'm sorry to disappoint you, is laughable, right? I think it's accidental that we learned about the United Way at the national level. There is no press policing of this. There is absolutely minimal IRS policing of this, and I hope maybe somebody here will explain the difference between a 501c3 and a 501c4 and how those can sometimes overlap and which is involved in political or lobbying activity. I mean, this is a vast area that the press doesn't cover, doesn't begin to know how to cover. And the difference between what you guys are doing now is mimicking the political process. Basically attempting to be what, in your estimation, the political process cannot be. The result of that is that the solutions are mainstream. I happen to be a nice mainstream person, that's fine. I'm prepared to have the political process get to the mainstream, because that's what I think a political process should do. I don't think that we should have you guys there providing the middle. I mean, I'd really like to know how far out of the mainstream any of the projects you're prepared to fund are. I think it's a rather narrow frame of reference, and to the extent news organizations accept what you do, accept your studies, look at your definitions, we never look at things out here. That, to me, is the fundamental problem.
I agree with you. I don't know if that surprises you or not, but I have felt for a long time on both points that you've made. One point is that we are indeed filling or trying to fill in probably a less than competent way a vacuum that has been created by the fracturing and discompetence of government over the years. That's not a good role for us to play, but we work in the public interest, and we take things as they are and try to do what we can to improve them. So it's kind of that's one of the reasons we're interested in governance reform, is that so the government can be better and we don't have to do a lot of the stuff that we are now trying to do where government might have done better. And we can go into more discussion about that. I think ultimately there is going to be a realignment of functions in the public and private sector where indeed the nonprofit and foundation community play an important bridging and balancing role between the for-profit sector and the public sector in a much more effective way than is currently the case. And that is the new order, I think, toward which we are driving anyway, not to diminish the public sector, but find a way to create a better balance between the interests and outcomes of the pure marketplace and the public sector, which is a pretty good representation of what the public wants, but not a perfect one. And it's that civic infrastructure outside of government, we believe, including foundations and nonprofits, that will always help to fill in some of that gap and promote change. On the question of coverage, I couldn't agree more. We try to talk with journalists about what foundations do and how they do it. It's hard for us to get interest. It's a complicated subject. It's an unfamiliar subject. The Council on Foundations, which is our national trade association, has a huge communications project underway to try to bring information to journalists about how we operate. But as I say, we are very different from each other. There isn't one story. There are really hundreds of stories. And if anything, I think we need more exposure and not less. Now, the exposure ought to be a balanced exposure that tells all of the terrible things that terrible foundations do and tells all the wonderful things that wonderful foundations do. And I'm not going to sit here and criticize the news organizations. I think you have your own criticisms of news organizations. But it is important, particularly for the civic enterprise, that we both engage around telling positive, constructive stories about our communities and good things that are happening, as well as finding scandals and conspiracies when those are indeed also happening. At any rate, I think we need more disclosure from foundations, as you've suggested, about what we do and why we do it, and we need more exposure from the press on those very questions. And we probably need, I won't say probably, we need more self-regulation. As an industry that is growing very fast, we are not self-regulated in the way we should be, and there's some of us who are working on that as we speak. So I am with you in your critique. I think we need to work together to figure out how to do it best.
All right, over here and then Angus.
I'm wondering if I could change the focus just a little bit. The focus here has been very much on foundations, but the title of your talk is Nonprofit Organizations as Citizens. And there are many nonprofit organizations that I guess maybe would be characterized as the typical 501c3 organizations that do not have a lot of money. Many of them are volunteer-based, but there are groups that are working very hard to try and affect changes in public policy. And I'm interested in knowing what their responsibilities are and what their chances are. Do they have to partner with a foundation in order to really be effective, or do they have some way on their own of working to bring about changes in public policy?
Elizabeth, there's an answer.
Let me just start, because I think that foundations have some responsibility in having created many of these nonprofit organizations. And I think that there's some discussion, certainly I know within our board, about what have we created, and let's not create any more because we're not funding the paperclip money within the organization. So there, from my point of view, I think that there's a responsibility, a long-term responsibility among foundations to say, what are these organizations doing, and to partner with them so that they can survive. I mean, I think that's a very important piece. As to their responsibility by those NPOs, that's a different question, I think. But I think foundations at the onset of this have to take a look at what they've done and see how we can work with many of these in collaboration to make change.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
Well, I'd just like to comment briefly. Another word for foundation or nonprofit is CBOs, community-based organizations. And you heard a lot about the CBOs during the 60s and the anti-war, anti-poverty efforts. I think that there is a growing interest in CBO model or the nonprofit model for delivery of social services. We've seen that, and then going back to your point about the United Way, I think those CBOs that don't have adequate financial controls, if you're running a food program, you better put the money in the food for the kids and don't, siphon it off for extra salaries for relatives. So we've had scandals in the CBOs, and so I think they were in somewhat, disrepute in some communities for a while. But I think they're coming back, and I think the faith-based, community-based organization is coming back. You're going to hear a lot more about that with George W. Bush when he comes in to California. So I'm just saying there is going to be, I think, a growing role for the community-based organization, and part of it is driven by the freedom that some of those organizations have to meet various constituencies, like, for example, constituencies that have certain languages that they speak. I was at a conference last Friday on farm worker health, and one of the problems that we have in our health delivery system in the Valley is many of these mainstream organizations do not have the staff who can speak the languages of the citizens that are being served. So there's a very important role, as California's diversity increases, for the community-based organization. And foundations and government, I think, need to be, at the forefront of providing resources for those very responsible, well-administered, tightly monitored community-based organizations.
Hey, Angus, and then the gentleman over here.
I came to this panel, my interest in it was because I worked for many years in international NGOs that are funded almost exclusively by North American foundations. And while I believe in the organizations that I've worked with, I've been disturbed by the ways in which sometimes they play an all too important role within the politics of relatively poor countries, especially poor countries with poorly developed democratic institutions. So, for example, the politics of conservation, international conservation organizations in Ecuador reaches scandalous proportions with respect to their disproportionate power in a political dialogue. In Costa Rica, where they're even more present, they raise less troubling questions because Costa Rica's own institutions are stronger in terms of putting them in context, which I think illustrates a little bit of the bigger problem that we're talking about here. And I want to tell one little story that I think I'd like your comment on with respect to defining the limits of foundation intervention. One of the organizations I worked for was dealt with pesticides. That organization at one point decided the best way to deal with that would be to select corporations and make them bad guys, as we often do, corporate campaigns. We were immediately told by one of America's largest foundations, one that you will hear about, you will hear mentioned on NPR tonight, that if we did that, our funding, which was substantial from them, would be cut. We would no longer receive any funding from them. I think it's an interesting illustration of what a number of people have been trying to get at here in terms of what does define the limits of foundation intervention within nonprofit organizations. And if anyone would like to comment on that, I'd be interested in hearing it.
Well, I'd like to comment because I really identify with your example. When I was in South Africa, the foundation NGO world was realizing that with the political change that they needed to work to strengthen government because now they had a constitution and they had eliminated apartheid, and they were redefining their role in strengthening the public sector rather than trying to be a kind of an outside government decision-making body to mitigate the adverse effects of government decisions. And so I think here in California, government shouldn't be seen as the enemy. It should be seen as a partner, and the foundation world should work with government to strengthen government. Nick talked a lot about governance. I would like to see the foundations be more interested in governing and with problem-solving solutions. Don't just tell us how we should organize ourselves, but be the laboratory for ideas and innovation and come in with solutions on how to get welfare moms to work or how to improve our child care system. And we're getting some of that, but not as much as we need to and not on a systematic basis. I think that in the environmental policy area, the same could be true of new opportunities for using new technologies. We had a very, I think, provocative discussion at the panel yesterday about, sport utility vehicles and air pollution in California? Do we have foundations that are funding, some creative research that would, better inform policymakers so that it isn't all driven by industry-driven research?
Yeah, Susan?
Oh, I completely agree with what you're saying. It seems to me we're only getting at it obliquely here. I feel like I'm being too nice and not properly I'm not properly conveying to you the deep concern I have. I would be ever so much happier if all of the foundations were entirely wrapped up in their original corporate donors, because then I could clearly, now I'm speaking not just as a journalist, as a citizen, I could clearly identify them with their interest. I think it's fine that they have an interest. Please have an interest. I just want to know who you are. My problem is with this much more pernicious, pervasive substitution, even if you assume absolutely perfect motive on everybody's part. We all want to do good, the public good. Well, everybody's got a different definition. It is, as I tell my students when they write, common cause, and then they array all the bad guys against common cause, and I inform them that common cause is a lobbying group. And they go, what do you mean? How can you say that? We attach a certain either neutral or positive value to charitable giving and to foundations that makes me terribly uncomfortable. I don't want you to be like an investor, right? In my newsroom, in my government. I understand that you have an interest in seeing that your money is well spent on whatever you fund, but when you say you think of your foundation as an investor, I go nuts. And when you say you think of your foundation as, or your group of foundations as neutral conveners, I go crazy, because it's your definition of neutrality. On what scale, on what spectrum? I think that's the piece of this discussion that's very hard to have, but that's the part that's troubling. And can I say one more thing? At the New York Times, which is my former employer before I joined academia, the news editor every so often would issue edicts about what could and couldn't be said in the paper. And one of the best edicts, and I don't know if it's still followed, is that you could not say nonprofit in front of groups, because it implied a certain, nodding to how wonderful they were because they were nonprofit. It conferred on them a certain pleasant status that the news editor thought was misleading, and I would...
We are running out of time. Let me, my apologies to the gentleman in the back who had his hand up a very long time.
Sorry.
No, because I think this has been, succeeded beyond my hopes. It seems to me that Nick talked about the need for the nonprofit world to develop better self-regulatory modes, and that he is working on that now. I think Susan was clear that there are problems out there, not the least of which is the media doesn't cover it. Jay reminded me that I really ought to be more careful about language, because there's a great difference between a nonprofit of the Irvine Foundation and a nonprofit of the League of Women Voters or California PTA. I think Elizabeth handed out a brilliant sort of guide to how we might start addressing some of these issues, so that we as citizens and as reporters can look and say, we know what that group is because there's this ranking, there's this disclosure, and what have you. And my own little bit, and I was very proud of myself, I didn't really butt in too much, but I will on this part. There seems to be, in the discussion, a sort of a, we don't set policies, but we like to set agendas, as though agenda setting is a neutral activity. It is not. Agenda setting is just as much a part of the policy process as the final vote. And that's my little bit. So go to the book room, and lunch is at 12:15.
One area where government really is functioning